This is Douglas Cameron introducing the Independent Radio News Review of 1986, a year which saw the Challenger spacecraft explode on takeoff and a nuclear cloud spread across Europe from Chernobyl, the AIDS plague, drug trafficking, violence in South Africa and the failed Reykjavik Arms Summit. There was barbed wire at Wapping and the Brighton bomber was jailed for life. Elsewhere, it was the year that Argentina took home the World Cup, Prince Andrew took home a bride, and the Queen went to China. Our team of reporters have brought you the news throughout the year, among them Dave Loyne, who presents this review of the people and events which have shaped 1986, beginning with terrorism and attempts to stop the terrorists.
My fellow Americans, at 7 o'clock this evening, Eastern Time, air and naval forces of the United States launched a series of strikes against the headquarters, terrorist facilities, and military assets that support Muammar Gaddafi's subversive activities. The attacks were concentrated and carefully targeted to minimize casualties among the Libyan people, with whom we have no quarrel.
Children in a school in Benghazi chanting anti-Reagan slogans. In one corner of the playground, an unexploded 500-pound bomb still lies on the sand a week after the American raid.
F-111 bombers took off from bases in Britain and hit targets in the Libyan capital Tripoli on the night of April the 15th. Among those killed was Colonel Gaddafi's adopted baby daughter. Libya's second city, Benghazi, was hit by A-6 bombers launched from US carriers in the Mediterranean. President Reagan's targets were military bases said to be responsible for terrorist attacks. In the civilian hospital, an injured baby whose father was killed was being cared for by Dr. Ramadan Salim. He told me that more than a dozen bombs had fallen onto a residential area in Benghazi, not onto terrorist targets.
Do you think places where the children and family living in peace, a terrorism target, do you think this is child? He can make a terrorism. I think what Reagan did, it is a part of his terrorism, not our terrorism. If he can say that we have a terrorism places, why he didn't hit it? He hit civilian places.
The Libyan raid was President Reagan's response to increasing American concern over terrorism. In the last days of 1985, 19 people were killed by Abu Nidal terrorists at Rome and Vienna airports. 10 days before the Libyan raids, 2 people, including a US serviceman, were killed in a disco bomb blast in West Berlin. But the monster of terrorism had many heads in 1986, and Syria was isolated by common market countries after Nazar Hindawi and his brother were jailed in Britain and West Germany. Hindawi had put a bomb in luggage being carried on board an Israeli airliner at Heathrow. The innocent woman carrying the lethal bag was his pregnant Irish girlfriend, Anne Murphy. He'd been helped by the Syrian embassy in London, and his brother was aided by Syrian diplomats in West Germany in another terrorist attack. 21 died while praying in a synagogue in the Turkish capital Istanbul. It was a suicide attack by 2 Arab gunmen. Several anti-Israeli groups claimed responsibility. 4 passengers were sucked out of a TWA jet in mid-air over Greece when a bomb blew a hole in the side. And in Japan, a plane made an emergency landing after a grenade went off in the toilet. A Pan Am jumbo was forced to land at Karachi airport with 4 Arab hijackers on board. The plane was on the tarmac for a day. Some Britons spent hours with guns to their heads after a stewardess hid the passports of Americans on board. Coventry businessman Adi El Mataru was one of those singled out.
He called me to the back and he made me sit down at the back seat. He put his gun, automatic machine gun, to my head and he said, "One word from you, you're dead."
Darkness fell, and when the lights in the plane failed, the hijackers started shooting. It was several minutes before Pakistani commandos reached the plane.
I've got a bullet which went to my back from one side and came out the other, and I've got a bit of splinter which is lodged near my backbone, near the spinal cord.
Despite his injuries in the attack, Mataru went back into the plane to try and save his family before he collapsed. 20 passengers and crew were killed. There were isolated acts of terrorism in Europe, with Germany's Red Army faction showing their links with the past by killing a senior government official, Gerald von Braunmühl, with the same .38 revolver used to kill industrialist Hans-Martin Schleyer a decade ago. A leading supporter of nuclear power, Karl-Heinz Beckertz, was blown up in his car, And in France, the urban terror group Action Directe killed the head of Renault Cars, Georges Besse. But another group of terrorists had more in store for France, in a campaign aimed at the release of Lebanese revolutionary leader George Ibrahim Abdallah. There were a few bombs early on in the year. The worst killed one person on board a high-speed train. Then, in September, a wave of bombs across the capital, Paris. The first hit a railway station, then 4 days later one person was killed at City Hall. There were 4 more bombs over the next fortnight, one at the police headquarters, and the worst, a bomb thrown into a crowded shop in the Montparnasse district killed 9. The heroes of Paris were 2 policemen, Jean-Louis Bretteau and Bertrand Gauthier, who carried a suspect package out of a cafe on the Champs-Élysées. It exploded in their hands in a car park, killing one. The other died in hospital later. At Bretteau's funeral, Prime Minister Jacques Chirac said they died protecting the 3 things held most dear by France: liberty, democracy, and the Republic itself.
Pour défendre les libertés, la démocratie et la République.
Europe's leaders joined together against terrorism.
Terrorism will only be defeated if governments not only promise to act, which is easy, but take action, which is more difficult. Action as we did over Syria. And I am very pleased that all our community partners have today agreed to join us in taking measures themselves to deal effectively with terrorism.
But while Europe was uniting against the terrorists, there were extraordinary revelations from Washington. Agents working in the White House were found to be selling arms to Iran, a country known to have sponsored international terrorism and now moving closer to victory over Iraq after the slaughter of their long war. And there was more to come in the scandal that became Irangate. The money earned from the sale of arms had been used to finance the Contra guerrillas fighting a dirty war in an attempt to bring down the elected government of Nicaragua. Earlier, President Reagan had been blocked from giving money to the Contras by the American Congress. The scandal threatened his tenure of the White House.
I authorized the transfer of small amounts of defensive weapons and spare parts for defensive systems to Iran. My purpose was to convince Tehran that our negotiators were acting with my authority to send a signal that the United States was prepared to replace the animosity between us with a new relationship.
The president's men said they wanted to sell arms to Iran to win the support of moderates who might succeed the Ayatollah Khomeini. But there was another reason for the arms sales, away from Iran, in the back streets of Beirut. Lebanon continued its mad course in 1986. Thousands died as rival militias fought for control of the Palestinian refugee camps in Beirut. Westerners living in the city continued to be fair game for the kidnappers. One night in November, a news agency there received a phone call from Terry Waite, the special envoy of the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose gentle persuasion has saved the lives of hostages throughout the Middle East. He'd slipped into Lebanon unannounced, and a day later a small plane landed at the military air base on Cyprus. On board, Waite and David Jacobson, released after 17 months in captivity. He remembered how Terry Waite had almost succeeded in winning his freedom a year before.
We almost had an opportunity to meet last Christmas. And even though Terry Waite's venture in Beirut did not bring us out, this man did one thing that we really appreciated. As we sat on the floor in our underwear on the day of Christmas Eve, he gave us hope. He gave us hope that we would be free men again, and we love this guy.
At the time, nobody knew that the freedom of Jacobson and others had been paid for with the shipment of arms to Iran. A month later, President Reagan and one of his most trusted advisers, Attorney General Ed Meese, appeared live on television to admit the arms to Iran cash to Nicaragua deal. A Vietnam veteran, Colonel Oliver North, was found to be the link man. He was barred from his office at the White House, and as he left, he said he would trust in God and a good lawyer. He refused to give any details of the plot when questioned at a congressional committee hearing.
I respectfully and regretfully decline to answer the question based on my constitutional rights. I don't think there is another person in America that wants to tell this story as much as I do, sir.
Swedish Premier Olof Palme was gunned down on the streets of Stockholm. The police have not caught his killer. 1986 was the year the superpowers failed to reach an arms deal in Iceland. South Africa slipped further into chaos. It was the year of Chernobyl and the year of Challenger coming up. On Monday morning, April the 28th, we had a call in the newsroom from a freelance reporter in Sweden. Staff had been evacuated from a nuclear plant there because of dangerous levels of radiation. But the radiation the instruments were measuring was from an accident hundreds of miles away. It had happened 2 days before, deep in the Soviet Ukraine. The report of the alarm bells in Sweden was the first the outside world heard of the word Chernobyl.
A zone of death 40 miles wide is creeping north across Russia and into Scandinavia from what looks like the worst accident in the history of nuclear power at the Chernobyl nuclear reactor in the Ukraine. Evacuation of the civilians is still underway.
In a series of blunders, technical staff in one of the 4 reactors at Chernobyl had turned off a number of safety devices before literally letting the plant boil over. The reactor exploded. Britain ordered the evacuation of language students studying at Kiev. They were given stringent tests by the Soviet authorities before flying home. Among them, Robert Walker from Bournemouth.
They had this sort of Geiger pointing at us, and I saw the needle going up to 20. They told me I was chista, I was clean.
The Soviet Union announced the results of their inquiry at a conference in Vienna, and they allowed Western experts to visit the scene. Dr. Robert Gale described his reactions on seeing it.
We are very hard-pressed to deal with the 300 victims of a nuclear reactor accident. I think it should be very evident how inadequate would be any response to a nuclear attack or thermonuclear war.
In October, a Soviet Yankee-class nuclear submarine caught fire and sank in the sea off Bermuda. It was carrying 16 ballistic missiles. President Reagan went to Iceland at very short notice on the invitation of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. The Americans had expected it to be little more than a chat before a full summit later in Washington. But the two men met for twice as long as planned, and what the Soviets had brought was a remarkable arms deal. Deep cuts of around half in long-range missiles, and the removal of all medium-range nuclear missiles in Europe, including the cruise missiles at Greenham Common. But it didn't happen.
This summit broke down because President Reagan wants to continue testing weapons in space. The Soviets offered drastic cuts in nuclear weapons across the world, provided President Reagan keeps Star Wars...
President Reagan offered to delay launching the Star Wars defensive shield for 10 years as long as he could continue to develop and test the system in space. But the Soviets want to keep Star Wars in the test tube. President Reagan spoke in public only once, at the bizarre setting of a giant hangar at the American base in Iceland, to an audience of thousands of cheering troops.
The Soviet Union insisted that we sign an agreement that would deny to me and to future presidents for 10 years the right to develop, test, and deploy a defense against nuclear missiles for the people of the free world. This we could not and will not do.
At a more conventional press conference, Mikhail Gorbachev accused the Americans of coming to Iceland empty-handed. Through an interpreter, he spoke in blunt language.
This has been a failure, and a failure when we were very close to very historic results. So this is the situation, the dramatic situation, as of now.
Relations between the superpowers got worse after Reykjavik. The Kremlin turned down a request from the White House for a televised New Year exchange of goodwill between the two leaders. Mr. Gorbachev took the world by surprise in allowing the dissident leader Andreh Sakharov to return from internal exile to Moscow. And one of the most famous refuseniks of them all was finally allowed to leave for the West.
Sharansky was given star treatment on his arrival in the West. A fast black official Mercedes limousine was waiting, engine running, on the Glinica Bridge, and a huge crowd...
Anatoly Sharansky was part of a spy swap. 3 came out with him. The Soviets took 5 back over the bridge.
I am not going to forget those whom I left in the camps, in prisons, who are still in exile, or who still continue their struggle for the right to immigrate and for their human rights.
American journalist Nicholas Danilov was briefly held in Moscow before the Iceland summit. He was swapped for a Russian caught spying in New York. More than 400 drowned when a Soviet cruise liner sank in the Black Sea. Violence continued in South Africa in 1986 as the majority black population continued to oppose a system which denies them basic human rights. The government says it's reforming gradually, but time is running out and pressure increased from the rest of the world to isolate the South African economy. President P.W. Botha says his country can stand up to sanctions designed to bring him down.
If we are forced until our backs are against the wall, we will have no alternative but to stand up in self-respect and say to the world, you won't force South Africans to commit national suicide.
Many died in the streets and squatter camps of South Africa. The exact figure is difficult to calculate because of increasing reporting restrictions, amounting by the end of the year to almost total state control and censorship over the news. The rioting included black violence against blacks as mistrust and fear spread. Many died from necklace killings, engulfed by the flames from a burning rubber tyre. Pressure increased to release jailed black nationalist leader Nelson Mandela. Meanwhile, a black man became the leader of the Anglican Church in South Africa for the first time. Nobel Peace Prize winner Desmond Tutu was enthroned as Archbishop of Cape Town. Even without formal sanctions, South Africa's business relations with the rest of the world have changed dramatically. A number of big American names have pulled out: IBM, Coca-Cola, Kodak, General Motors and General Electric, and Playtex. And after years of protests here, Barclays Bank sold their South African interests. But many Western governments, including Britain, stood out against breaking trade links with South Africa. A group of Commonwealth leaders held an emergency summit in London in August and failed to change Mrs. Thatcher's mind. Afterwards, Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi told me that the centre of gravity of the Commonwealth has moved away from London.
Britain is not the leader anymore, not in the Commonwealth, and is losing its position because it's compromising on basic values and principles for economic ends.
And Robert Mugabe, Prime Minister of South Africa's northern neighbour Zimbabwe, was even more bitter.
Britain has failed us. Britain has let the people of South Africa down. Britain has let Africa down.
Yoweri Museveni became president of Uganda after a bloody civil war. President Machel of Mozambique died with many of his closest advisers when their plane crashed mysteriously over South Africa. Mozambique is now suffering an appalling famine. The famine in the countries of northern Africa continues. Experts say they could now be about to face a plague of locusts. 60 died when a Sudan Air plane carrying aid workers was shot down. A whole village of 1,500 people was wiped out in Cameroon in an explosion of natural toxic gas. Thousands were evacuated from Aden after an attempted coup in southern Yemen. The Royal Yacht Britannia went to the rescue, and the ship was filled with refugees who slept everywhere except in the Queen's bed. In the Philippines, President Marcos called a snap election, faced with communist guerrillas in the hills and a growing opposition movement led by Cory Aquino, the widow of murdered opposition leader Benigno Aquino. The election was openly rigged. President Marcos, though, was swept from power in a weekend revolution. He held on for as long as he could.
I'm standing in downtown Manila, just a few blocks from one of the entrances to the Malacañang Palace where President Marcos is holed up.
There is no way under which I can step down or resign from the position of president.
People are cutting down trees in the middle of the street to use them to block the road. They have rocks, they have tree trunks, they have their bodies, they're sitting, they're lying, they're starting fires in the street.
The long agony is over. We are finally free, and we can be truly proud of the unprecedented way we achieved our freedom, with courage and with determination, and most important, in peace.
People power in the Philippines was made possible by the strong support of the Catholic Church. The Archbishop of Manila, Cardinal Sin, told me how it was organized.
They called me the field marshal because I was the one calling the people, telling them to be in that particular sector, to give food for 3 days and 3 nights.
Benazir Bhutto, the daughter of the executed former leader of Pakistan, returned home from London and tried to repeat the success of People Power. There were big rallies on her return, but she spent much of the year in jail. Hundreds died in communal rioting after a drugs raid in Karachi. The son of the former dictator of Haiti, Papa Doc, had to flee the country after a series of violent demonstrations. Baby Doc now lives in France. The former Emperor Bokassa returned from exile in France to face trial in the Central African Empire. 1,000 died in an earthquake in El Salvador. On the 28th of January, the American space shuttle Challenger was launched in the freezing cold of a Florida morning on a routine flight from Cape Canaveral.
4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
30 seconds into the flight and all was going well. The engines were throttled back. Then...
Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
The words, "Roger, go at throttle up," were the last spoken by Challenger Captain Michael J. Smith. The spacecraft exploded. Its 2 solid rocket boosters detached and blew off. 2 trails of smoke formed a claw in the sky around the remains of the shuttle. School children across the states watched live as America's first ordinary citizen to go into space, teacher Krista McAuliffe, was blown up in front of them.
The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
President Reagan announced that the space program would continue, but the shuttle was grounded and 2 unmanned American rockets exploded on takeoff. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union successfully launched a massive space station which will form the basis for a permanently manned Soviet complex in space. Just before Christmas, an aviation success restored America's pride when Dick Rutan and Gina Yeager took their spindly Voyager plane around the world on a single tank of fuel. At home, there was Westland, Nimrod, and the Peter Wright affair, record sentences in the courts, and barbed wire at Wapping, next in the News Review of 1986. This is Dave Loyne with the Independent Radio News Review of 1986. The year began with an extraordinary saga over the future of a helicopter firm in Somerset. The issue itself was simple. Would Britain's last major helicopter manufacturer be saved by European cash, or would it be taken over by Sikorsky, an American firm? Defence Secretary Michael Heseltine backed the European option. He believed it was being ignored, and he stormed out of a cabinet meeting after Mrs. Thatcher imposed unacceptable constraints on discussion.
I had no choice but to accept or to resign. I left the cabinet.
But the scandal didn't stop there. A letter from a senior government law officer to Mr. Heseltine was leaked to the press by officials of the Department of Trade and Industry, where Secretary of State Leon Brittan was backing the American Sikorsky bid. Suddenly, the affair was no longer just about helicopters, but about the behaviour of ministers and officials at the highest level of government. Who had authorised the leak? Mr. Brittan made a statement to MPs, but they weren't satisfied. He came back to a crowded House of Commons at 10:30 at night.
I had no intention of misleading the House in this matter, and therefore wish to come and explain the sequence of events immediately. If it is thought that I have in any way misled the House, I apologise unreservedly.
Apology was not enough. Mr. Brittan was the second casualty of the scandal, and Labour scented more blood.
The House is not satisfied, the country will be not satisfied that she has given us the full details. I ask her again, when truly
the affair provided the angriest scenes in Parliament of the year, and Mrs. Thatcher tried to keep the Westland affair away from the door of Number 10.
exactly what was going on.
What the right honourable gentleman can't stand is that I've given him the facts and that they have been checked. I have given him the facts. He doesn't like them. Mr. Speaker, the party opposite have deliberately blown up this issue out of all proportion.
Labour MP Tam Dyell was expelled from the Commons for a day after this outburst.
I say that she is a bounder, a liar, a deceiver, a cheat and a crook.
After Westland, plans to sell Land Rover and Leyland vehicles to America's General Motors were scrapped. Another crisis with Westland echoes erupted at the end of the year over the decision to buy American AWACS radar planes and scrap the British Nimrod project. The government was embarrassed in the Australian courts when they tried to stop publication of a book by former MI5 man Peter Wright about Soviet penetration of Britain's secret services. Tory Deputy Chairman Geoffrey Archer resigned in a strange affair where he tried to pay off a prostitute for apparent blackmail, although he'd never met her. It all sounded like a plot from one of his books. He was polite, but said little to journalists who besieged his home.
Are you going to be able to pick yourself up again like you did the last time?
I shall certainly try.
Do they understand what...
Right, that's it, chaps. Hope you have a good trip home.
A House of Commons committee found that discharges from the Sellafield plant in Cumbria made the Irish Sea the most radioactive stretch of water in the world. On land, NIREX tried to get into 4 sites to see if they were suitable for the dumping of low-level nuclear waste. There were widespread protests and a few songs.
Oh, we are the nuclear dustmen with all our nuclear wastes. We don't know where to put the stuff, oh, ain't it a disgrace?
The teachers' dispute went on, and after months of negotiations, the local authority employers reached a deal with most of the unions. But Education Secretary Kenneth Baker said it would cost too much and not reward success. He threatened to impose his own deal.
The long, dreary history of these negotiations and the attendant disruption to children's education mean that I cannot stand by and trust that all will come right in the end.
But by Christmas, it looked as if more talks could produce a deal acceptable to all. Unemployment remained high, still at over 3 million by the end of the year. The unemployed march from Jarrow in the northeast on a crusade to Westminster, 50 years since the last time.
It's important to me that I get a job through this year, hopefully, and we want to succeed.
Given peace in this country, we're on the verge of a Labour victory, and therefore this march will achieve success much, much quicker than the 36 one.
It means an awful lot, not just to me, but I think to just let everybody see that we really mean business, that we're just sick of just being forgotten about, that we're human beings, we're not a statistic, we're human beings with feelings, we have families to support and bring up and look after, and I don't think it's a lot to ask.
Employment Secretary Lord Young said that jobs are being created.
There are signs of improvement. Unemployment has stopped rising. We've had the largest 3-month fall in unemployment since 1973. At the same time, vacancies have been rising for month after month for the last 9 months in a row and are now at their highest level this decade.
Prince Charles continued his campaign to get a better deal for the inner cities. He launched a charity to help small-scale schemes using local people to improve communities.
Bold steps have to be taken. A leap in the dark, if you like. I see the potential whenever I go to these areas, and it drives me mad that others seem blind to the immense possibilities that are there.
Time ran out in 1986 for a tier of local authorities. Greater Manchester, Merseyside, Tyne and Wear, West Midlands, South Yorkshire and West Yorkshire are no more, and London no longer had a citywide authority. The GLC went out with a bang, and a street party of more than 250,000 people.
The first chime of midnight, it's April the 1st. The GLC has breathed its last. County Hall is still brightly illuminated with floodlighting. And there goes the farewell fireworks display.
GLC leader Ken Livingstone said he would be back. He's prospective parliamentary candidate for a North London constituency, and he's going for the top.
It really gets up people's nose at home when they see some politician on television saying, "Oh, I have no personal ambition myself. I only seek to do whatever the public want me to do." And we all know it's a load of old cobblers. And I think it's much better to be honest. Yes, I want power, I want to change Britain, and I'm not ashamed to say it.
The Conservatives began a campaign against Labour local councils. Labour continued to get rid of Trotskyist revolutionaries who joined the party under the banner of militant. Leading members of Liverpool's Labour Party were expelled. Derek Hatton went to the Blackpool Party conference to appeal, but refused to put his case when the television cameras were excluded.
We said that we are not prepared to see a British Labour movement act more in kin with Stalinist Russia than the history of the British Labour Party. We were not prepared to take part in that, and tomorrow
After losing his post on the council, Derek Hatton is now running his own PR agency. The Labour Party put defence firmly on the political agenda, with a general election probably in 1987.
I would, if necessary, fight and die. Fight and lay down my life for my country and what it stands for. I would die for my country, but I tell you, I would never let my country die for me. That is the choice that faces.
The Liberal-SDP alliance was nearly torn apart by a row over defence in the autumn. By December, they had a new policy. Britain's oldest national newspaper, The Times, went behind the barbed wire at Wapping with its brasher stablemate The Sun and other News International titles. To make the move, Rupert Murdoch bussed in specially trained electricians to print his papers. He sacked 3,000 members of the traditional printing unions.
We asked them for 6 years to come here. We begged them that up to a year ago they wouldn't answer our telephone calls. They wouldn't listen to anything at all.
The sacked workers demonstrated outside the gates of the fortified factory. The East End was turned into a battleground with a large area under police control. Print unions spent the year trying to win a just settlement and their jobs back. On a ballot, they turned down compensation. SOGAT leader Brenda Dean believes the Wapping dispute could go on for as long as the miners' strike.
Attitudes are bitter, positions are polarised. They feel that we went through a dreadful winter last winter. We have stuck it out all summer, and if it means sticking it out a bit longer, OK, we'll do that too.
Britain saw a new quality newspaper for the first time in 131 years, The Independent, and a new tabloid, Today, had a rocky start under the flamboyant Eddie Shah. Mrs Thatcher and the French agreed to build a Channel tunnel, but money for the project is proving hard to find. A fire started by an old woman lighting her way to bed with a candle gutted the south wing of Hampton Court. There were layoffs in the North Sea oil fields, and Sheikh Yamani was sacked as Saudi's oil minister. The world tin market went into a severe crisis. In March, trading ceased on the London Metal Exchange. The government stepped in at the last minute to save the remnants of Cornwall's tin industry. The floor of the stock exchange became a less exclusive place as the Big Bang removed the traditional distinctions between jobs. London joined the world's money markets, which now pass on the financial baton as the globe spins and markets open and close. On the first day, it was all too much for London's computer, which blew up. There were insider dealing scandals here and on Wall Street. The Tory dream of popular capitalism continued with the sell-off of national assets. British Airways is next in the pipeline. In 1986, there was TSB and British Gas, enthusiastically sold by Energy Secretary Peter Walker.
We're embarking upon the biggest privatisation, not only in the history of this country, but in the history of the world. And naturally, if you see Sid, I hope you'll tell him.
More than £50 million was spent in advertising British Gas shares. £20 million was earmarked to combat the spread of AIDS with an advertising campaign on billboards, in newspapers and on TV and radio.
This is Paul Gambaccini. I'm not here to play records. People I know are dying of AIDS. I don't want you to join them. AIDS is
Around 300 people have now died of AIDS in Britain. 30,000 are carriers of the virus. Drug trafficking continued to spread. The government launched a new campaign and gave money to South American countries in an attempt to stop the spread of cocaine. The Marquis of Blandford was convicted of using cocaine. He walked free. His pusher was jailed for 5 years. An American drummer was found dead in Boy George's flat. The rock star himself was fined for using heroin.
I deserved it. I was very grateful it wasn't more. Very grateful. Just don't take it. And, you know, I was given it first in Paris, and I didn't even know what it was, you know, and very stupidly I took it. It did nothing to me at all. It actually made me sick.
Olivia Channon, daughter of a cabinet minister and heiress to the Guinness fortune, was found dead in the room of Oxford undergraduate Count Otto von Bismarck after a student party. She'd been drinking Guinness and champagne and mixed the cocktail with drugs. 45 died when a Chinook helicopter carrying oil workers from the North Sea to the Shetlands fell out of the sky. It was the world's worst helicopter crash. Incredibly, an RAF rescue helicopter was in the air when the tragedy happened and took 2 survivors out of the sea. They were the pilot, Pusht Vade, and oil worker Eric Morans, who managed to cling to a life raft despite 2 broken arms. His father, Joe, described the dramatic rescue.
He must have lost consciousness when he went under the water, because when he came to the surface, he regained consciousness then. And the thing about it is that the helicopter's life raft came up and inflated, not a yard from him, and that's what saved Eric.
13 died in a coach crash on the M4. 111 Gurkhas were dismissed from the army after a brawl. They had to dismiss them all, as none would tell against another. Brighton bomber Patrick McGee was sentenced to life imprisonment. The so-called M4 rapist John Steed was jailed for rape and killing a woman in Park Lane. Jeremy Bamber was jailed for killing his adopted parents and sister and her 2 small children. It was nearly the perfect crime, but his girlfriend informed on him after the police had believed him innocent. 5 died when a farmhouse was set alight at Fordingbridge in Hampshire. A Midlands policeman, Brian Chester, was found not guilty of manslaughter after he shot a child, John Shorthouse, during a raid. In an extraordinary affair in Manchester, Deputy Chief Constable John Stalker was suspended for several months while his alleged contacts with alleged criminals were investigated. He was cleared of any wrongdoing, but was taken off an inquiry into claims that Ulster's police had a policy of shoot to kill when faced with suspected terrorists. He resigned from the force 3 months after being reinstated. One of his last jobs was to join police on Saddleworth Moor in the Pennines, looking again for the bodies of dead children.
Well, I was a detective sergeant at the time, 1964-65. We spent a long time up there, and it's part of our professional lives, something we'll never forget. And I speak not just for myself, but for probably every policeman who was on that inquiry. We hope that this is the beginning of the end. We can put this behind us before we retire. I hope, for the region's sake, that this is put behind us, because it is deep in the psyche of this part of the world.
Moore's murderers, Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, had been jailed for killing 2 children, but the police always believed they'd killed others. 2 other children had disappeared at the same time. Once again, dogs and men dug on the moors. Then, after the snow started, Myra Hindley herself went back to the moor where she'd last been so long ago. The police had a new area to search. Next in the news review, Northern Ireland, the royal wedding, and we remember those who died in 1986. '86 was the year that Ulster said no. In rallies and a one-day strike, Ian Paisley led loyalist opposition to the Anglo-Irish Agreement signed in November 1985. The deal was aimed at improving relations between the North and South, particularly over security. In a dramatic demonstration of the problems of border security, Paisley's deputy, Peter Robinson, led 500 men to an occupation of a village in the Republic. He was arrested on his way back to the north and spoke to us from a Gardaí prison cell.
We have the worst area of South Armagh with a gaping hole in it, and if 500 men can walk around in what's supposed to be bandit country, how much easier must it be for the IRA going in ones and twos?
There were isolated sectarian killings of individual Protestants and Catholics, and the IRA carried out a series of mortar bomb attacks on police stations. One stick of mortar bombs fell wide, and for the first time the IRA apologised to their unintended civilian targets. The IRA's political wing, Sinn Féin, meeting in Dublin, took a major step. They voted that in future they'd take up any seats won in the Irish Parliament. It was the issue which had split Sinn Féin into the officials and provisionals in 1970, and it now split again. Former IRA chief Rory O'Brody became one of the leaders of the new Republican Sinn Féin, upholding the history of violent struggle against Britain.
We uphold the historic right of the Irish people
to use whatever degree of controlled and disciplined force is necessary in resisting English aggression and bringing about an English withdrawal from our country forever.
Jennifer Guinness, whose husband John is a prominent member of the banking branch of the Guinness family, was held by kidnappers for 8 days. IRA suspect Evelyn Glenn Holmes was released after Britain made 2 bungled attempts to extradite her in Dublin. Officials here didn't fill in the forms properly. A Dublin court jailed the alleged Chief of Staff of the Irish National Liberation Army, Dominic McGlinchey. In sport, the United Kingdom sent 3 teams to Mexico. Scotland and Northern Ireland didn't win a match, but England got as far as the quarter-final, where they were knocked out by Argentina. The game saw the most controversial sporting moment of the year.
Just outside the area, lovely ball into Maradona. Maradona with a header. Maradona has scored. England are furious. England claim handball. It looked very much like it as Maradona went up, but the goal is given. Maradona races away to the far side to celebrate.
Argentina won the cup and the Mexico wave spread around the world. Liverpool won the double. In cricket, England had a rotten year until they found form for the Ashes series in Australia. Ian Botham was banned for most of the summer after telling a Sunday newspaper that he once smoked pot. Somerset sacked 2 West Indian players, Viv Richards and Joel Garner, and Botham left in sympathy with them.
I think the longer you sit back and think about it, the more annoying it gets that a player of Viv's calibre and Joel's calibre to be treated by a club that they've given 13 and 9 years respectively service to, I think it's disgusting. The
Commonwealth Games in Edinburgh were a disaster. Most countries pulled out because of Britain's refusal to impose sanctions against South Africa. Bradford's Joe Johnson became world snooker champion, but Nigel Mansell just failed to win the Grand Prix World Championship. Frank Bruno from Wandsworth went to Wembley.
I've been training for 8 years, you know, and I'm willing to go in there and die, you know what I mean?
But although the crowd was on his side, he was knocked down by terrible Tim Witherspoon. Virgin boss Richard Branson succeeded on his 2nd attempt at setting a speedboat record across the Atlantic. He was seldom out of the news and became the Prime Minister's figurehead in her Clean Up Britain campaign. An airship flew over London on a commercial flight for the first time since 1937. The Voyager spacecraft sent back the first ever close-up pictures of Uranus, and Clint Eastwood became mayor of Carmel in California. The remains of a 5,000-year-old mammoth were found in Shropshire, and the dog licence was scrapped. It had remained at the same price since it was introduced at 7 and 6 more than a century ago. Fixed penalty tickets were brought in for a range of minor driving offences. Corporal punishment was outlawed in schools in England and Wales, and an 8-year-old boy became the youngest ever to pass O-level maths. Bob Geldof became a knight. As an Irish citizen, he won't be called Sir, but he was pleased all the same when a British diplomat arrived at a recording studio in Los Angeles with the news.
There's all this racket going on. There were all these layabouts with long hair like hanging around there, all these musicians were playing. And he said, Mr. Geldof, could I see you in private? And he said, Her Majesty's government on behalf of Her Majesty would like to sing so-and-so. I went, oh, you know, how much is that worth? You know, I actually said that to him, I think, and he went, well, it's a great honour. I said, I know. I said, thank you very much.
The world put on its running shoes for Geldof's final charity push, Sport Aid. Women were given the right to work up to the age of 65. The Queen celebrated her 60th birthday and went on the first ever visit by a British monarch to China. She saw the sights and worked on relations with China's communist leaders, but the visit was overshadowed by remarks the Duke of Edinburgh is said to have made in a private conversation to students. Apparently, he said he found Peking boring, and if the students stayed too long, they would end up with slit eyes. Palace Press Secretary Michael Shea tried to limit the damage.
He was having a very jokey, lively conversation, asking them about the studies they were doing here. He is second to none in terms of the appreciation he has of the warm welcome which he's received here in China. To suggest that the Duke of Edinburgh in any way is disparaging either about the Chinese or about the welcome or about Peking is total nonsense.
July the 23rd was Royal Wedding Day.
I, Sarah Margaret.
I, Sarah Margaret.
Take thee, Andrew Albert Christian Edward.
Take thee, Andrew Albert Christian Edward.
To my wedded husband.
To my wedded husband.
To have and to hold.
To have and to hold.
From this day forward.
from this day forward.
For better, for worse.
For better, for worse.
For richer, for poorer.
For richer, for poorer.
In sickness and in health.
In sickness and in health.
To love, cherish, and to obey.
To love, cherish, and to obey.
Till death us do part.
Till death us do part.
According to God's holy ordinance.
According to God's holy ordinance.
And thereto I give thee my troth.
And thereto I give thee my troth.
Prince Andrew signed on for a professional career in the Navy, and Fergie learnt how to fly. A jazz band played in a Manchester street for the funeral of Coronation Street's Elsie Tanner. Pat Phoenix died in hospital. She'd married Tony Booth on her deathbed. We heard the last from the voice of rugby league Eddie Waring. Another commentator, former England cricketer Jim Laker, died, and cricket also lost Bill Edridge. Footballer Sir Stanley Rouse died, and one of the greatest jockeys, the popular Sir Gordon Richards, died. Ted Moult shot himself. Comedian Billy Dainty and Thin Lizzy singer Phil Lynott died, as did Alf Garnett's silly old moo Dandy Nichols, and French writers Jean Genet and Simone de Beauvoir. The world of politics mourned Lord Boothby and the sudden death of the popular Liberal MP David Penhaligon in a car crash. And two of the grand old men of Westminster died, the former docker Manny Shinwell at 101 and former Conservative Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, the man who told Britain, "You've never had it so good." At the end of his life in the House of Lords, he elegantly criticised the privatisation policies of his descendant at number 10, who, he said, is selling off the family silver.
It is very common with individuals or estates, when they run into financial difficulties, to find that they have to sell some of their assets. First the Georgian silver goes, then all that nice furniture, and then the Canalettos go.
It was the end of an uncomfortable era for the royal family, with the death of the Duchess of Windsor, the divorced American whose marriage to King Edward VIII had forced his abdication 50 years ago. It was revealed this year that the death of the king before that, George V, had been speeded up by his doctor to reach the deadline of the morning edition of the Times. The 1930s continued to dominate the obituary columns of today, with the deaths of former society hostess Lady Diana Cooper and the King of Swing, Benny Goodman. The Russian who gave his name to homemade petrol bombs, Vyacheslav Molotov, died, and the man who gave his name to whirling swimming pools, Candido Jacuzzi, died. The political world saw the last of by-election enthusiast Lieutenant Colonel Bill Boakes. Songwriter Alan J. Lerner died. One of the first two men to conquer Everest, Sherpa Tenzing, died, and broadcasting lost Sir Hugh Weldon and Stuart Young. The arts lost tenor Sir Peter Pears, author Christopher Isherwood, and sculptor Sir Henry Moore. Hollywood mourned the loss of two of its greatest stars, James Cagney and Cary Grant. Stuart Granger leaves us with this tribute to Cary Grant.
He was the romantic, suave, debonair, stylish leading man. I mean, they don't make him like that. I mean, who is there now? Or who was there then?
You've been listening to the Independent Radio News Review of 1986, presented by Dave Loyne, with production and research by Charlie Rose. The engineer was Tim Cumming.